what mindfulness begins to tell us is that we live in the world of change, and yet there is an awareness, a spaciousness or openness that can allow that change without being lost in it, without being lost in the past, without being lost in the future, that can really be alive each day and take each day as it is. Because actually that's all we have, is one day at a time. And anything else is just a fantasy, or in some cases a nightmare, right? Let me see this poem from Rilke, if I can find this. Breathing, you invisible poem, complete interchange of our own essence with world space. You counterweight in which I rhythmically happen. Single wave motion whose gradual sea I am. You, most inclusive of all possible seas, space grown warm. How many regions in space have already been inside me? There are winds that seem like my relatives. Do you recognize me, air, full of places I once absorbed? And what happens when we sit, and sitting isn't the only way to be mindful. You can be mindful as you jog or drive or bake bread or whatever it happens to be. But we sit because our lives are complicated and we forget. And to sit is an invitation to this sacred presence, which the breath breathes itself, and the mind, which is caught up in attachment and fears, in what's called the body of fear, this small sense of self, sees all those stories. They're really like movies, aren't they? They come and, they have good plots. I mean, they're not new plots, but they're good plots, and they star you-know-who. As Miss Piggy would say, moi, right? And to be mindful isn't to get rid of our experience, but to notice what's there and become bigger than that, to become spacious enough so that the feelings of loss or fear or longing or sobbing, my teacher said, if you haven't wept deeply, you haven't really begun to meditate. Maybe it's a year of sobbing, who knows? Like we talked about last week, a year of doing metta for oneself. I think that our society is not one that has too many tears, but that we haven't really grieved many of the things, the warehousing of mostly men in our, 2 million people in our prisons. Could shed a lot of tears for that. The tears for the potential that this country is founded on, and the fact that we still make a huge amount of our money as a nation by exporting weapons and killing machines. It's one of our main exports. So to become mindful is to allow oneself to sit in the presence of gain and loss, and of sorrow and suffering, and beauty and love, and breathe and say yes, as if you can bow to all of that. It brings us to the place of rest, a connectedness with this human life as we've been given it, without judging, without expecting. And when I say without judging, it doesn't mean you can't make decisions, but the decisions come from a deeper, more silent place than all our fears, when we sit in the presence of our life. So it's not a kind of quality that, oh, now I'm becoming spiritual. Spare your friends, right? It's an embodied human and divine sort of wedding. Somebody talked about belonging, because we live in a culture where there's so little belonging in some ways.